The darkest nights of five boxing legends. Sugar Ray Robinson versus Joey Maxim, 1952. When nature became the opponent. When historians compile lists of the greatest boxers who ever lived, one name appears with remarkable consistency at or near the top: Sugar Ray Robinson. His record of 173 wins, 19 losses, and 6 draws across a career spanning from 1940 to 1965 tells only part of the story. Robinson wasn't just successful, he was revolutionary, combining speed, power, and ring intelligence in ways that redefined what excellence in boxing could look like. Robinson's dominance was such that he held the welterweight championship for 5 years and won the middleweight title 5 separate times across different eras of his career. He defeated every credible challenger his weight classes could produce. His only professional losses came against opponents who caught him at disadvantageous moments or exploited the cumulative toll of his extraordinarily active fighting schedule. But on the night of 25th of June 1952, at Yankee Stadium in New York City, Sugar Ray Robinson experienced the only stoppage defeat of his entire career, not from an opponent's punches, but from environmental conditions so brutal that they turned a boxing ring into a furnace. Robinson was challenging Joey Maxim for the World Light Heavyweight Championship. This represented Robinson moving up from his natural middleweight division to challenge for a title in a heavier weight class, a testament to his confidence and ambition. Maxim was a solid, durable champion with a style built on conditioning and the ability to absorb punishment whilst gradually wearing opponents down. The weather conditions that night were oppressive. New York was experiencing a heat wave, with daytime temperatures exceeding 35 degrees Celsius. By the time the main event began at approximately 10 p.m., the temperature had barely dropped. Inside Yankee Stadium, with tens of thousands of spectators packed together and powerful ring lights blazing down, the conditions became almost unbearable. Contemporary newspaper accounts described the arena as feeling like a blast furnace. The ring lights, necessary for the television broadcast, this was one of the early major fights televised nationally, generated tremendous additional heat directly above the ring where the fighters competed. Spectators in the upper decks complained of temperatures approaching 40 degrees Celsius. What the fighters experienced in the ring itself was undoubtedly worse. The heat affected everyone. Ruby Goldstein, the referee, actually collapsed from heat exhaustion during the fight and had to be replaced by Ray Miller for the later rounds, an almost unprecedented occurrence in championship boxing. If the referee, who wasn't absorbing punches or engaging in the physical exertion of fighting, couldn't withstand the conditions, the challenge facing the actual competitors was extraordinary. From the opening bell, Robinson boxed brilliantly. His speed advantage over the naturally bigger Maxim was evident immediately. He moved fluidly, landed clean combinations, and made Maxim miss repeatedly. The judges' scorecards reflected Robinson's dominance. He was winning every round, building a commanding lead that should have made victory inevitable. But as the fight progressed into the middle and later rounds, something began to change. Robinson's movements, while still superior to Maxim's, started to slow. His combinations became less frequent. Between rounds, his corner worked frantically to cool him down, applying ice and water, but the relief was temporary. The accumulated heat exposure was taking its toll. Contemporary accounts describe Robinson beginning to stagger between rounds by the 10th. His legs, which had carried him through hundreds of professional fights, were becoming unreliable. The heat was causing dehydration and probably early stages of heat stroke. His body was shutting down, diverting resources from muscle function to desperately try to regulate his core temperature. Still, Robinson continued. Through the 11th round, through the 12th, through the 13th. Each round saw him maintain enough skill to outbox Maxim, But the margin was narrowing as Robinson's physical condition deteriorated, whilst Maxim, built for endurance and perhaps better suited to fighting in extreme conditions, maintained his pace. At the end of the 13th round, Robinson returned to his corner and collapsed onto his stool. His trainer and cornermen worked desperately to revive him, but his body had reached its limit. When the bell rang for the 14th round, Robinson could not rise. His legs wouldn't support him. His trainer signaled that they could not continue. For the first and only time in a career spanning over 200 professional fights, Sugar Ray Robinson failed to answer the bell. The fight was stopped, and Joey Maxim retained his light heavyweight championship by technical knockout in the 14th round. The aftermath saw Robinson hospitalized briefly for treatment of heat exhaustion and dehydration. Medical experts who examined him confirmed that he'd been suffering from heat stroke during the later rounds, a potentially life-threatening condition that occurs when the body's temperature regulation systems fail. Had the fight continued, Robinson might have suffered permanent injury or worse. The defeat was particularly frustrating because Robinson had been winning decisively on all scorecards. Had he simply survived to the final bell, he would have won a unanimous decision and claimed the light heavyweight championship. Instead, he suffered the only stoppage loss of his career whilst ahead on points. Muhammad Ali versus Larry Holmes, 1980. The painful end of an era. By October 1980, Muhammad Ali was 38 years old and had been retired for 2 years. His body bore the accumulated damage of one of the most remarkable careers in boxing history. 3-time heavyweight champion, Olympic gold medalist, cultural icon, and arguably the most famous athlete on the planet. He'd survived brutal wars with Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ken Norton, and countless others. His legacy was secure. Yet Ali returned to the ring on 2nd October 1980 to challenge Larry Holmes for the WBC Heavyweight Championship at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas. The reasons for the comeback were complex. Financial pressures stemming from poor investments and generous but financially ruinous support of friends and family, a desire to prove he could reclaim glory one more time, and perhaps the inability of a man defined by boxing to accept that his time had passed. Holmes was 30 years old and in his absolute prime. He'd held the WBC heavyweight title since 1978 and was undefeated in 35 professional fights. More significantly, Holmes had been Ali's sparring partner in the mid-1970s, learning from the master whilst developing his own devastating left jab and solid fundamentals. He knew Ali's style intimately and had studied every aspect of the older man's technique. The stark contrast between the two fighters was evident from the moment they entered the ring. Holmes looked sharp, fit, and ready, a champion in his prime. Ali looked diminished. His face was puffy, possibly from the effects of medication he was taking. His body, while still recognizable as that of an athlete, lacked the definition and conditioning of his earlier years. Most troublingly, his movements during the pre-fight rituals showed none of the fluid grace that had once defined him. Medical examinations before the fight would later come under intense scrutiny. Ali underwent the required tests at the Mayo Clinic, and doctors cleared him to fight, despite findings that should have raised serious concerns. Later reports revealed that the pre-fight physical had detected abnormalities in Ali's neurological function and kidney tests, but these were either minimized or not given the weight they deserved. From the opening bell, it was clear that this would not be competitive. Holmes, who'd revered Ali as his mentor and hero, faced the heartbreaking task of systematically dismantling the legend who'd inspired him. Ali's famous speed was gone. The reflexes that had allowed him to slip punches whilst barely moving his head had deteriorated. The legs that had once carried him through rope-a-dope tactics and 15-round wars couldn't sustain basic movement. Holmes dominated from the start, but showed visible reluctance to pour on punishment. He later admitted that he'd pulled punches, unable to fully commit to destroying his idol. Still, the accumulation of shots landed cleanly. Ali's defense, once built on supernatural timing and movement, was non-existent. He absorbed jabs, hooks, and combinations with minimal resistance. Rounds passed with grim inevitability. Ali occasionally showed flashes of his old self, a combination thrown with proper technique, a defensive move that recalled his prime. But these moments became increasingly rare as the fight progressed. Mostly, he simply survived, absorbing punishment whilst offering token resistance. The crowd at Caesar's palace, initially electric with anticipation, grew progressively quieter and more uncomfortable. They'd come expecting magic, perhaps a final miracle from the greatest showman boxing had ever known. Instead, they witnessed a painful demolition of a faded legend by a younger, stronger fighter who clearly took no pleasure in the task. Between rounds, Ali's corner worked frantically to motivate him, to find some spark of the old fire. Ali's longtime trainer Angelo Dundee, who'd been in his corner for every significant fight of his career, watched with growing concern. The man on the stool in front of him wasn't the fighter he'd trained for decades. This was someone whose body could no longer execute what his mind still believed possible. By the 9th round, Ali was offering almost nothing offensively. He stood in front of Holmes, absorbing punches, occasionally throwing counters that lacked power or accuracy. His face was swelling, his eyes showing the effects of accumulated shots. The fight had become an exercise in one-sided punishment. After the 10th round, Dundee made the decision that Ali himself would never make. He climbed into the ring and told the referee the fight was over. Ali protested weakly, but Dundee's authority was absolute. The referee stopped the contest, marking the only time in Ali's career that he lost by technical knockout. The immediate aftermath was sobering. Ali left the ring defeated, not by a knockout that might be explained as a lucky punch, but by systematic, sustained dominance from a younger, fresher fighter. The post-fight medical examination revealed that Ali had lost significant weight in the weeks before the fight, despite claiming to be in excellent condition, a sign that something was seriously wrong with his metabolism or health. In the years that followed, the full extent of Ali's physical decline became apparent. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's syndrome, a degenerative neurological condition likely caused or significantly worsened by the accumulated head trauma of his boxing career. The tremors, slowed movements, and speech difficulties that would define his later years were already beginning to manifest at the time of the Holmes fight. Medical experts who later reviewed the case argued that Ali should never have been cleared to fight. The pre-fight examinations that detected abnormalities should have been disqualifying. The Nevada State Athletic Commission, responsible for licensing the bout, faced criticism for allowing a clearly diminished fighter to compete. Holmes himself carried psychological scars from the fight. In interviews decades later, he described the experience as one of the most difficult of his career, not because the fight was physically challenging, but because defeating Ali felt like destroying something sacred. He'd grown up idolizing Ali, had learned from him as a sparring partner, and then had been forced to systematically beat him in front of the world. The Ali-Holmes fight represents more than just a one-sided defeat. It symbolizes boxing's complicated relationship with its legends, the sport's tendency to allow fighters to continue beyond the point where they should stop, the financial and ego-driven motivations that override medical wisdom, and the tragedy of watching greatness diminished by time and accumulated damage. Muhammad Ali would attempt one more comeback fight in 1981, losing to Trevor Berbick in what was mercifully his final bout. But it was the Holmes fight that truly marked the end. The night when the world had to accept that even the greatest eventually face limits that courage alone cannot overcome. Joe Louis versus Rocky Marciano, 1951. The brown bomber knocked through the ropes. Joe Louis was not simply a great heavyweight champion, he was an American institution. From 1937 to 1949, he dominated the heavyweight division with a completeness rarely seen in any sport. He defended his title 25 times, a record that stood for decades. His knockout of Max Schmeling in 1938 carried symbolic weight far beyond boxing, representing American resolve against Nazi Germany. During World War II, Lewis served in the military and became a symbol of patriotic duty. But by 1951, the Brown Bomber was 37 years old and facing financial ruin. Despite earning enormous sums during his championship reign, millions of dollars at a time when that represented extraordinary wealth, Louis had virtually nothing left. Poor financial management, generous support of friends and family, and most devastatingly, massive tax debts to the Internal Revenue Service had left him desperate for income. The IRS had pursued Louis relentlessly for back taxes on his fight purses, claiming he owed approximately $500,000, an astronomical sum in 1951. Lewis's attempts to negotiate or settle had failed. The government wanted payment, and Lewis's only marketable skill was boxing. So despite having retired in 1949 after a long and punishing career, Lewis returned to the ring. His opponent on 26 October 1951 at Madison Square Garden in New York was Rocky Marciano, an undefeated rising contender with a record of 37-0, including 32 knockouts. Marciano was 28 years old, 9 years younger than Louis, and represented a new generation of heavyweights, crude in technique compared to Lewis's classical style, but relentless in pressure and devastating in power. The matchup was promoted as a passing of the torch, though that romantic framing obscured a harsher reality, an aging legend fighting for money against a younger, stronger opponent who represented everything Louis could no longer be. Marciano revered Louis, had grown up watching his fights, and later admitted that the prospect of facing his childhood hero filled him with conflicting emotions. In the weeks before the fight, Louis attempted to recapture his old form. He trained seriously, lost weight, and worked on the fundamentals that had once made him unstoppable. News reports from his training camp were cautiously optimistic. Louis looked good for his age, still possessed his famous right hand, still had the ring intelligence that had served him so well. But good for his age was a telling qualifier. He was being compared not to current heavyweight contenders, but to expectations lowered by time. The fight began with Louis showing flashes of his former brilliance. In the early rounds, he landed clean shots that would have troubled any opponent during his prime. His jab, once the finest in heavyweight boxing, still snapped Marciano's head back. His right hand, properly set up, still carried power. For brief moments, spectators could see echoes of the fighter who dominated the division for 12 years. But Marciano kept coming. His style, constant forward pressure, brutal body punching, relentless aggression, was perfectly designed to overwhelm an older fighter who could no longer sustain movement and defensive positioning for extended periods. Marciano absorbed Louis' best shots and kept walking forward, throwing wide hooks and uppercuts with frightening power. By the middle rounds, the pattern was clear. Louis would land clean punches, but they no longer had the impact to discourage Marciano. The younger man would walk through them and respond with combinations to Lewis's body and head. Lewis's legs, which had carried him through so many championship fights, began to betray him. His movement slowed. His defensive positioning deteriorated. The 8th round brought the end, though not before Louis showed one final flash of his former self. He landed a combination that staggered Marciano briefly, a reminder of what he'd once been. The crowd erupted, hoping for one last miracle. But Marciano recovered quickly and launched a devastating assault. A right hand caught Louis cleanly, then another. Louis staggered backward toward the ropes. Marciano followed with a left hook that landed with sickening force. Lewis's legs gave way completely. He fell backward through the ropes, his body draped over the lower rope, half in the ring and half out. a devastating image that was captured by photographers and would become one of boxing's most iconic and painful photographs. The count began, but Lewis was clearly finished. He struggled to pull himself back into the ring using the ropes, but his legs wouldn't support him. The referee reached 10, with Lewis still tangled in the ropes. The fight was over. Rocky Marciano had won by knockout in the 8th round. The immediate aftermath was respectful, but sad. Marciano, who'd just scored the biggest victory of his career, showed no jubilation. He went to Louis' corner and embraced his fallen idol, later saying that defeating Joe Louis was not a moment of triumph, but one of the saddest experiences of his life. He'd grown up idolizing the Brown Bomber, and now he'd been the instrument of his definitive defeat. Louis left the ring that night having fought his last professional bout. The image of him draped through the ropes, knocked out by a younger, stronger fighter, became the lasting visual memory of his career's end, overshadowing, at least momentarily, the years of dominance that had defined him. The financial situation that had forced Louis back into the ring was not resolved by the fight purse. The IRS continued pursuing him for years. Louis eventually found work as a greeter at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, a position secured through connections in the boxing world. The man who'd once been heavyweight champion of the world, who'd represented American strength and determination, spent his later years shaking hands with casino patrons, a melancholy coda to a legendary career. Joe Louis died in 1981 at age 66. His funeral was attended by boxing royalty and political figures, recognition of his cultural significance beyond the sport. But the image of him knocked through the ropes by Marciano remained one of sport's most poignant reminders that time defeats every champion eventually, and that financial desperation can force proud men to continue long past when they should have stopped. Henry Armstrong versus Fritzy Zivic, 1940. When rough tactics ended a historic reign, Henry Armstrong's achievement in 1938 remains one of boxing's most extraordinary accomplishments. He simultaneously held 3 world championships, featherweight, lightweight, and welterweight, at a time when there were only 8 recognized weight divisions in the sport. This meant Armstrong held nearly 40% of all available world titles at once, a feat that will almost certainly never be replicated given modern boxing's fragmented championship landscape. Armstrong was a relentless fighter whose style was built on overwhelming volume. He threw punches in combinations that sometimes exceeded 100 per round, maintaining a pace that broke opponents' will as much as their bodies. His conditioning was legendary, his determination absolute. Between 1937 and 1940, he was virtually unbeatable, compiling a record that included wins over every credible challenger in 3 weight classes. But by October 1940, Armstrong had relinquished his featherweight and lightweight titles to focus on welterweight, where he'd defended successfully 19 times. His next challenger was Fritzy Zivic, a Pittsburgh fighter with a reputation for roughhouse tactics that bordered on, and often crossed into, illegality. Zivic came from a family of fighters. His brothers were all professional boxers, and they'd built their success on a style that prioritized winning by any means necessary. The fight took place on 4th October 1940 at Madison Square Garden in New York. From the opening bell, it was clear this would not be a conventional boxing match. Zivic employed tactics that, by modern standards and even by the more lenient standards of 1940s boxing, should have resulted in immediate disqualification. He used his head as a weapon, butting Armstrong repeatedly. He threw elbows. Most devastatingly, he used his thumb to gouge Armstrong's eyes, a tactic so blatant that ringside reporters and spectators could see it clearly. Contemporary newspaper accounts described the fight as one of the roughest and most brutal contests ever seen at Madison Square Garden. The referee, Billy Cavanaugh, issued multiple warnings to Zivic but never deducted points or disqualified him, despite the flagrant violations. This reluctance to enforce rules strictly was partly a product of the era's boxing culture, which valued toughness and tolerated rough tactics far more than modern boxing does. Armstrong, to his credit, never quit or complained during the fight. He continued pressing forward, throwing his characteristic volume of punches, trying to overcome Zivic's dirty tactics through sheer output, but the cumulative effect of the fouls was devastating. By the middle rounds, Armstrong's left eye was swelling badly from repeated thumb jabs. His face was cut in multiple places from headbutts and elbows. Blood streamed from his nose and mouth. The eye gouging was particularly damaging. Zivic's thumb found Armstrong's left eye repeatedly throughout the fight, and by the later rounds, Armstrong's vision in that eye was severely compromised. He couldn't see punches coming from that side, couldn't judge distance properly, couldn't defend himself effectively. Zivic, recognizing the advantage, targeted the damaged eye relentlessly. Despite the punishment, Armstrong showed flashes of the brilliance that had made him a triple champion. He landed clean combinations, hurt Zivic on several occasions, and demonstrated the heart that had carried him through so many championship fights. But he was fighting two opponents, Zivic and the referee's unwillingness to enforce basic rules. That combination proved too much. After 15 brutal rounds, the judges awarded the decision to Zivic. Armstrong had lost his welterweight championship, and with it, the last of his 3 simultaneous titles. His historic reign had ended not through being outboxed in a fair contest, but through a combination of rough tactics and officiating that allowed those tactics to continue unchecked. The immediate aftermath saw Armstrong hospitalized with severe eye damage. Doctors who examined him found significant trauma to his left eye, including possible permanent damage to his vision. The injuries were consistent with repeated thumb gouging, an illegal tactic that modern boxing treats with zero tolerance, but which 1940s officiating had essentially permitted. The fight prompted considerable controversy in the boxing media. Many reporters who'd witnessed the bout wrote scathing critiques of both Zivic's tactics and the referee's failure to control them. Nat Fleischer, editor of The Ring magazine and one of boxing's most respected authorities, called it one of the dirtiest fights he'd ever witnessed. But the result stood, and Zivic was recognized as welterweight champion. Armstrong and Zivic would fight again in a rematch on 17th of January 1941, also at Madison Square Garden. The second fight followed a similar pattern, Zivic using rough tactics, Armstrong fighting through them, the referee allowing much of it to continue. Zivic won again by unanimous decision after 15 rounds, confirming that Armstrong could not overcome the combination of Zivic's style and permissive officiating. After these defeats, Armstrong's career declined rapidly. He never held a world title again, though he continued fighting until 1945. The damage from the Zivic fights, particularly the eye injuries, had taken a permanent toll. Armstrong's later bouts showed a fighter whose physical tools had been compromised by accumulated punishment and specific injuries that never fully healed. The Armstrong-Zivic fights remain controversial case studies in boxing history. They raise uncomfortable questions about where the line between toughness and fairness should be drawn. Boxing has always been a rough sport. The objective is to strike opponents with force sufficient to potentially cause unconsciousness. But does acceptance of that basic premise mean accepting thumb gouging, headbutting, and other tactics that have nothing to do with boxing skill? Modern boxing has largely answered these questions by enforcing rules much more strictly. Repeated fouls result in point deductions. Egregious violations lead to disqualification. Referees are trained to protect fighters not just from excessive punishment, but from illegal tactics that can cause permanent injury. The improvements in officiating standards can be traced directly to fights like Armstrong-Zivic, where the failure to enforce basic rules allowed a champion to be dethroned through methods that had little to do with legitimate boxing. Henry Armstrong was elected to the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990, his simultaneous three-title reign recognized as one of boxing's most remarkable achievements. Fritzy Zivik was inducted in 1993, his roughhouse style acknowledged as effective even whilst controversial. Their fights remain a reminder that boxing's history includes not just noble warriors and artistic brilliance, but also moments when the sport's darker elements, the willingness to win by any means necessary, and officials' failure to prevent it, determine championship outcomes. Roberto Duran versus Sugar Ray, Leonard II, 1980. The two words that stunned the world. Roberto Duran entered the 1980s as one of boxing's most feared competitors. Manos de Piedra, Hands of Stone, wasn't just a nickname, but an accurate description of what it felt like to be hit by the Panamanian warrior. His lightweight championship reign from 1972 to 1979 had been marked by absolute dominance. His transition to welterweight had been seamless, culminating in a stunning victory over Sugar Ray Leonard on 20th June 1980 in Montreal. That first Leonard fight had been a brutal, physical war. Duran had forced Leonard to abandon his natural boxing style and engage in the kind of toe-to-toe battle where Duran's superior inside fighting and raw aggression gave him the edge. Duran won by unanimous decision, taking Leonard's WBC welterweight title and cementing his reputation as a fighter who imposed his will on every opponent, regardless of their skill level. The rematch was scheduled for 25th of November 1980 at the Louisiana Superdome in New Orleans. In the months between fights, however, Duran made a critical mistake. Believing he'd solved Leonard and confident in his superiority, Duran didn't maintain the disciplined training regimen that had characterized his career. He celebrated his victory, enjoyed his fame, and reportedly ballooned in weight. By some accounts, he reached over 180 pounds before beginning serious training for the rematch, nearly 35 pounds above the 147-pound welterweight limit. This meant Duran had to lose enormous amounts of weight rapidly to make the contracted weight. The crash diet and dehydration necessary to achieve this left him weakened, though he wouldn't admit this publicly. At the weigh-in, Duran made weight but looked drawn and depleted, a stark contrast to Leonard, who appeared fit and ready. Leonard's strategy for the rematch was fundamentally different from the first fight. Instead of trying to match Duran's aggression, Leonard decided to use his superior speed and movement to frustrate the champion. He would make Duran chase him, waste energy, and experience the humiliation of being unable to impose his will. This was psychological warfare, as much as physical competition. From the opening rounds, Leonard executed his game plan perfectly. He moved constantly, circling away from Duran's power, landing quick combinations and then escaping before Duran could respond. More provocatively, Leonard began showboating, dropping his hands, sticking out his chin, doing the bolo punch, windmill motion that was more theatrical than effective. He was deliberately taunting Duran, trying to make him angry and reckless. Duran, accustomed to intimidating opponents and imposing his aggressive style, found himself chasing shadows. Leonard's movement was too quick, his exits too clean. The combinations Leonard landed weren't doing significant damage, but they were scoring points and, more importantly, humiliating Duran in front of a worldwide audience. By the middle rounds, Duran's frustration was evident. He was throwing punches at empty air, being made to look slow and crude. The showboating intensified. Leonard would land a combination, then literally turn his back on Duran and walk away, a gesture of supreme disrespect in boxing. The crowd, initially supportive of the champion, began to sense something was going wrong. Then came the 8th round, one of the most controversial moments in boxing history. About 16 seconds remained in the round when Duran, clearly frustrated and possibly physically depleted from his weight cut, simply stopped fighting. He turned away from Leonard, raised his hand, and said to referee Octavio Meyran, "No mas, no more." The moment was so unexpected that even Leonard seemed confused. Referees, cornermen and spectators sat in stunned silence for a moment before the reality sank in. Roberto Duran, the warrior, who'd built his reputation on relentless aggression and refusing to quit under any circumstances, had surrendered in the middle of a championship fight. Meyran waved off the fight, declaring Leonard the winner by technical knockout. The Superdome erupted in confusion and anger. What had just happened? Why would Duran, who'd never quit in his life, suddenly give up whilst not being hurt or in immediate danger? The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Duran's corner claimed he'd been suffering from stomach cramps, possibly from the weight cut or something he'd eaten, and couldn't continue. Some reports suggested he'd said, "No puedo, I can't," rather than "no mas," though the distinction mattered little. Duran himself gave conflicting explanations over the years, sometimes claiming injury, other times acknowledging frustration with Leonard's tactics. The boxing world reacted with shock and condemnation. Duran, who'd been celebrated as one of the toughest fighters in the sport, was now vilified as a quitter. The no mas moment became a permanent stain on his legacy, mentioned in every biographical account, every highlight reel, every discussion of his career. In Panama, where Duran was a national hero, the reaction was even more intense. Many Panamanians felt betrayed and humiliated. Duran, who'd represented his country with fierce pride, had surrendered on the international stage. The psychological toll on Duran was severe. He slipped into depression, gained more weight, and seemed lost. But remarkably, Duran rebuilt his career. In 1983, he moved up to junior middleweight and defeated Davey Moore for the WBA title. In 1989, at age 38, he defeated Iran Barkley for the WBC middleweight championship. These later achievements partially rehabilitated his reputation, proving that the no mas moment didn't define his entire career. Medical experts who later analyzed the fight suggested that Duran's extreme weight cut likely played a significant role in his surrender. Rapid dehydration and rehydration can affect cognitive function, pain tolerance, and emotional regulation. A fighter who normally would push through discomfort might, in a compromised physical state, simply decide the punishment isn't worth continuing. Leonard's tactical approach also deserves credit. By refusing to engage on Duran's terms and instead making him chase, miss, and look foolish, Leonard created a psychological crisis that a fully healthy, properly prepared Duran might have overcome, but that a depleted, frustrated Duran could not. The no mas fight remains one of boxing's most analyzed and debated moments. It represents the intersection of physical preparation, psychological warfare, and the unpredictable human element that makes sports compelling. Roberto Duran entered that night as a feared champion and left as the man who quit, a label he spent the rest of his career trying to overcome. With considerable success but never entirely escaping the shadow of those two Spanish words that stunned the world.